Okay, so one question that we've been asked is we had a panel member who we had to disqualify. That's a big question for us, and that was. Can you all hear me? Okay, that was Daniel Schindler. Yeah, I'll use it if it's on. Yeah, it's on. Okay, great. Okay, all right, great. So what I posted on the screen here is the National Research Council policy on bias, and they have two. As I mentioned, we're following National Research Council policies on how we set up panels and what the conditions are under which panel members participate. And one of the ones that's critically important to us, particularly in this situation, is that panel members have to agree to work without compensation, and that's an NRC policy. So we pay travel expenses, but we at federal rates, federal travel and hotel and per diem rates, but we don't compensate people for their participation. So Science Advisory Committee's been doing that for 3 years, and the science panel members have been doing it now for 4 or 5 months, 6 months in some cases, and have been doing a tremendous amount of reviewing pages and pages of documents. So that's one of the policies. There are two other ones that I think have been really important to us, and one has to do with bias, and the other has to do with conflict of interest. Conflict of interest is really a financial conflict, and the financial conflict is either that the individual has been paid either by Pebble or by an opposition organization to actually do something, do a study or do some sort of an analysis or something. So those are sort of direct conflicts of interest where there would be a direct payment for some service on either side. Indirect conflicts of interest have more to do with how. I can give you a couple of examples, but one of the geologists that we were considering using in Alaska is Leanne Monk, who's a geologist, and her geology department at UAA is actually funded. The research is funded by Pebble, so she's not doing any research that has anything to do with the development of a mine, but the department is actually funded. So that's a potential conflict of interest. Just regarding the funding. We also looked at when we were considering panel members to try to fill out the panels. When we got recommendations for people's names as potential panel members, one of the first things we did was we did a lot of research to try to vet those names to see if we could come up with any conflicts of interest, and if we did, we would disqualify them before we put them on the panel. Or biases. So let me go into bias a little bit, and then I'll come back to Dr. Schindler. So bias is a little bit more tricky because it's hard to make that a direct connection between the individual and on how the bias is created. It's not like a financial connection where you can track that. So instead, what the National Research Council does is look for what they would consider reasonable indications that a bias exists, and this is the policy that sort of describes it. So it says, and it's talking about the National Research Council. So we're applying this, but it says. NRC policy on bias, it is essential that the work of committees that are used by the institution in the development of reports not be compromised by issues of bias and lack of objectivity. Questions of lack of objectivity and bias ordinarily relate to views stated or positions taken that are largely intellectually motivated or that arise from the close identification or association with an individual or a particular point of view, or the positions or perspectives of a particular group. So what it's really looking for is if we were to do research on somebody, and we've actually done a lot of this, but when we find opinion articles or op-ed pieces that we would consider sort of an activist approach, somebody taking an activist approach and going out and taking a public position, stated public position, in a document that we could identify, that is exactly what this policy is really getting at. Is, have you taken that position? Have you taken a strong position, or potentially any position that could cause people to question your ability to be objective? So as I said, we have actually ruled out quite a few people who were recommended to us because we've discovered this. There is an exception to this, and the exception is it says that potential sources of bias are not necessarily disqualifying for purposes of committee service. Indeed, it is often necessary in order to ensure that a committee is fully competent to appoint members in such a way as to represent a balance of potentially biased backgrounds or professional or organizational perspectives. So the National Research Council, if you're familiar with some of the reports that they've published, they put together a committee, and the committee considers all of the data together when they're coming up with their recommendation. Then the National Research Council staff puts together a report, and it's generally a consensus among panel members as to kind of how what the recommendation would be. Kirk, I believe, has served on National Research Council panels. I know that one of our other committee members, Rod Eggert, has. I don't know if other science panel members have served on NRC committees, but when we talk to NRC to kind of clarify this, but basically what they're saying is that if a balance of representative views is made up of if the panel is composed of a balance of representative views, and you have views that tend to be biased in one direction and tend to be biased in another direction, and that creates a balance, then that is actually an acceptable way to move forward, given that the scientific expertise is necessary and that the bias is sort of well balanced. In our case, what we found when we started to get into the review process is that we have individual panel members who were reviewing individual chapters. So we have an expert on in this case we have an expert on geology and mineralization. We don't have a panel on geology and mineralization. We were able to get one expert. We have a couple of experts on water quality, but generally we have one expert that's focused on a chapter, and you'll see this throughout in the other documents or other panels as well. So that makes it more difficult for us to find a balance. So what it means is that we have to be more diligent around this particular policy, and when we find it, we have to take it seriously. So in the case of Dr. Schindler, he's a scientist who we identified probably 4 years ago as being somebody who would be probably really great on working on our panels, either as a science advisor or on one of the panels. We did the vetting process that we generally do with panel members at that time, and he stayed on our list. He stayed in the pool because we didn't find anything. When we formed the Fish, Wildlife, and Habitat panel that Milo Adkisson is helping us put together, we thought we had all of the chapters covered by individual people, except the ones that we knew we couldn't find chapters on, and we did a lot of research, a lot of kind of searching to find appropriate people, and in some cases we couldn't find them. But we actually, one of the recommendations that was made by our panel is we should get Dan Schindler to review the Lake Iliamna study, because he would be perfect for that. So we contacted him. This was late, sort of late in the game, so it's probably a month and a half ago. maybe 2 months ago that we actually made the initial contact. And we didn't do that. We didn't do the follow-up research on the vetting. And then we actually have some people who watchdog the process, and they want to make sure that the panels are objective, because that's our goal. So there's a lot of that actually going on, and we got word that that Dr. Schindler had written an op-ed piece in a newsletter in Seattle called Crosscut, and he co-authored it with a gentleman who we've interviewed on our process that has is an commercial fishing industry executive. So the two of them co-authored this op-ed piece that that clearly met this particular standard. So they had taken a position, largely intellectually motivated, that clearly created the perception of a bias. So this was fairly traumatic because we really felt strongly that Dr. Schindler could be objective, but the problem was we didn't want to run into a situation where any opinion that he made on the rendered on the baseline studies or recommendations could be discounted by people who didn't think he was biased. So we decided because of that we would very, very reluctantly and very painfully disqualify him. So unfortunately, we didn't. Ordinarily, we would have done that research, and in this case, we didn't do the follow-up, and so we had to now go back and correct that that error that we'd made. So that's probably a long version of it. I probably could have given you that in a much shorter version, but yeah.
Does that mean I have to say who I am and all that? So I'm Phil North. I work for the Environmental Protection Agency, and I remember reading that piece of writing, but I don't remember what it said. But I do recall recently, kind of Schindler in his own defense saying, "I was simply defending the science." It was just a response to criticisms of science. So he seemed, I mean, at least in his view, he was staying within the realm of science and talking about science and good science or not good science. And so do you have a summary of what he said or why what he said was not acceptable?
We don't try to necessarily interpret what the National Research Council means by that. So presumably all of the means by this statement.
Right.
So
it seems like you would have to interpret that in order to say whether something. I mean, all of these scientists write all the time. So, and they express probably opinions here and there
right.
on different subjects.
Yeah. No. But I think generally all of these things are about the science. I think that's one of the things that makes this a little bit tricky is that if Dr. Schindler had directly opposed Pebble, it likely would have been framed around science. And he and I have had email exchanges and conversations beyond this, and I think he understands the importance of bias. He also believes, as we do, that he could be objective. But we're dealing entirely with perceptions, and so the perception clearly is that he is not. And the indication of that is the article. So I actually don't have the article in front of me. I think we could pull it up and see what it says. I think it's primarily defending EPA's science and EPA's assessment. In the process of doing that, I believe there is more of an attack on, or probably the wrong words, but I'm not, because I'm not sure how he meant it. But when we read it, we really thought about whether or not this is a clear, is this clearly intellectually motivated? Is it a position taken, and can we just ignore it? Or can we mince it in some way that makes it okay? And we may have been able to do that from the perception of people who believe that he's biased and he can't be objective. That's what we have to think about, is how an audience would interpret that. So, yeah, I don't think that's a probably very satisfactory answer, but that we're looking for that perception. Other.
Is it your call or Pebble's call?
It's our call. It's the Keystone Center is trying to. Our primary goal in this is to make this as objective as possible, and the reason for that is because it's clear to us that what's happened here is that the science has become very polarized, and it's very difficult for the public to tell whether the science is accurate or the science is being there's an advocacy role in the science, and they don't know whether to trust it. So, because of the message, so I think what I've said to Dr. Schindler is what we're finding is that the messenger is getting in the way of the message, and the message may actually be very credible, but if people see the messenger and don't trust the science, then we have a problem. We actually call this the Al Gore effect, and that's the kind of issue, that's the kind of situation we're dealing with. So it's entirely our decision to do this, and we take all of the responsibility for not doing this in the way that we should have. But if we had done it, we wouldn't have invited Dr. Schindler on the panel, because this would have come up, and the Science Advisory Committee would have kind of agreed that this is probably a problem. Again, even though we felt that he could be objective. Other questions about that? Yeah, Dave.
Yeah, Dave Chambers with the Center for Science. Todd, you briefly mentioned objectivity, and I have to take issue with something you said in the last session, and that was that the non-PLP scientists didn't provide you with the information in the format that you requested. My role for a number of the groups here is to try to coordinate some of the scientific research and analysis that's going on the Pebble mine. And I want to stress coordinate as opposed to direct. There's a distinct difference there. But as a part of that coordination effort, we provided to Keystone the water quality data that our organization had collected. We provided that in an Excel format that was not locked. We provided Keystone with all of the written reports that we have done. The water quality data was also integrated into a database that the Nature Conservancy had that has some fisheries information, some information on macroinvertebrates, and virtually everything we could pull into that integrated database on the site. And I know that was provided to Keystone in actually two different formats, Microsoft Access and an Excel format. Again, it was not locked like the data from Pebble was locked. And in terms of the reports, Keystone has all of the written reports that our group has done. And I would argue that that's not, again, true with Pebble. I know, for instance, there are consultants like SRK. I would love to see the geochemistry reports that I know that they have, and that was not provided as a part of this environmental baseline document, although I know that they're there. So I don't know, maybe you want to explain to me why it is that you say that non-PLP scientists didn't provide Keystone with information in the format that you asked for it, because I don't understand that.
Okay. Well, we'll have to look at what we have on file that you sent that we actually put on our website. So whatever we put on our website is what the non-PLP scientists told us that they wanted our science panel members to review. So that's what we were. So what we have there is what we were told when we asked non-PLP scientists to submit white papers for review, for our panels to review. That's what we got, and so that's all on our website. So we can check that and see what kind of format it's in. There are really two questions here. One question is, did we apply a different standard to the non-PLP scientists that we applied to Pebble, and then the other question is, what did we actually get, and what format did we get it in? Okay, that's the question you're asking. So the standard, the double standard question, I think, is important one to us because we requested that Pebble give us data in a user-friendly format, and as Jane described this morning, they didn't feel that they could do that. We tried to figure out ways of doing that, but then we would run into problems. If we had data and other people didn't, then that wouldn't have seemed fair. So the solution to the whole problem, the sort of awkward solution, is that the scientists converted data from PDF format and unencrypted the data, or unencrypted the files that were password protected, and that everybody figured out how to do that, and they did it on some studies. So that's the information that we didn't receive. So and I don't know. I'm not sure why we didn't receive it. Maybe the reanalysis was done, and there was nothing to reveal. It didn't reveal anything about it. But when we asked for that information, what we were told was, we actually didn't get it. I mean, I had conversations with Dave Alpert about it, and we actually didn't get the information that we thought. So our point was not, we wanted the panel members to have the ability to review the anybody's information in addition to Pebbles. If you wanted the panel members to review it, then you would submit it through the Keystone Center so that we could make it available. We asked Pebble to make it available in a user-friendly format. We asked other scientists to make it available in user-friendly format. The question is, did we get it in the user-friendly format? With Pebble, we didn't. With other scientists, I think, if you're correct, some we did, some we didn't. But what we were really looking for is the reanalysis of the data that we thought would be important for our science panel members to review, and we didn't get that. So I don't know why we didn't get it, but we didn't get it. So, and I don't want. I mean, Dave Albert and I had some conversations about that, and I'd be happy to, to share those with him and resolve this sort of offline why we didn't get it. But we didn't get it.
Okay. Well, again, you have all of the written analysis that we did.
Yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, none of that was not passed to you. So I think what I'm hearing you saying is that the data that you say you didn't get was the Pebble partnership data that says do not cite, do not quote on their literature, and that actually I think was copied laboriously from several different sources and then put in. So it's that Pebble data you're talking about.
No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the current baseline studies, and I'm talking about, I think this is maybe, there's some water quality data and there's some fisheries data that I think was, so that we're talking about the stuff that was first password protected, then in PDF format. So, and there was reanalysis of that information going on because we were having conversations with the scientists that were doing that, and we thought that information would be included in the review, and it wasn't submitted to us. So,
okay. Well, again, for clarification, you have all the written analysis that we have, and to the best of my knowledge, the only data that you don't have is that we may have in an unlocked format is the Pebble data. itself. You have everything we have. It's all in several different formats to make it available to you.
Well, I guess I can't say that we have everything. I know what we have, and I can show you what we have. I actually don't know if there are things that we don't have. I'll be happy to show you what we do have.
Okay, what I'm saying is you have it all. Right?
Okay, I'll take your word for it, but I actually don't know that.
Todd, Randy Hagenstein with the Nature Conservancy, and Dave Albert, who you mentioned, serves on the Nature Conservancy staff here in Alaska as our Director of Science. And your statement earlier today was that, frankly, none of the non-PLP scientists submitted any information that didn't meet the criteria of being digital, being accessible, not being password protected or encrypted. And in fact, as Dave has referenced, there are a group of scientists that did submit a considerable amount of information. The Nature Conservancy provided you with a CD of information that included an integrated Microsoft Access database that had fish distribution, water quality, macroinvertebrate information, geocoded, tied back to the reports that were also in that. Now, there's one piece of analysis that we did not give you, and that's the subject of the conversation that you and Dave Albert had over the past couple of weeks. And that was an analysis of information that our staff had taken and converted from PLP. We felt that that was not our data to share. True, we had taken that data and done some reanalysis of it, taken their water quality information and combined it with some of the information that we had generated. But at the end of the day, even though I agree with you that that would have been a useful piece of information for the science panel to have, we decided that you should really go to the source of that information and not rely on someone else's conversion and reanalysis of it. So that was related to one specific analysis. But I think if you look at the broad array of information that the Nature Conservancy provided, and as Dave Chambers mentioned, other scientists provided, the statement that, frankly, none of the information submitted by non-PLP scientists met that standard of being digital in an analyzable format and not password protected is incorrect. Now, I feel a little bit like we've got a situation of the story runs on page 1 with a room full of people, and the retraction is on page 17. Now we've got a room that's a quarter full of people. So it would be helpful for me if you would sort of maybe clarify that your comments were really directed at one particular analysis, not at the full body of science provided by the larger group of non-Pebble scientists.
I'd be happy to do that, but I need to look at what we received in order to be able to do that. I know that if I recall, most of the information that we were sent was still in a PDF format. Now there may be tables that you all sent digitally that we'd have to look at just to make sure.
So I did just request this information from Dave Albert after you made the comment this morning.
Okay.
And he said, yes, we submitted the integrated database in MS Access format with all the sample locations and results of water quality samples, fish distribution, aquatic macroinverts that correspond to the analyses in the summary reports. The summary reports were provided in a PDF format, linked back to this integrated Microsoft Access database that meets sort of the full criteria that you listed this morning. Okay.
All right. I'd be happy to check it, and I'll totally take your word for it. So, but again, there's really two questions here. One is whether or not we held Pebble to a different standard than we held you all to, and we didn't. What you're saying is you complied with it and Pebble didn't. I will accept that. The standard was the same, and I think that's one of the questions that I think is troubling to the Keystone Center, is that there's a perception and there's an argument that there's a different standard being applied.
I'm not making any comment on what Pebble did do or what Pebble didn't do.
Okay.
I'm just saying that the way you characterize the information provided by non-Pebble scientists this morning was inaccurate.
Okay, and I'd be happy to check that. Okay. Are there other questions or comments about the Keystone? One of the things that I would like to do our panel members are not here, and we're almost back to needing to come back for lunch. But another question that's come up that I wanted to kind of address has to do with one of our panel members dropping out of the panel because he felt that he couldn't evaluate the baseline studies. And I said a little bit about that earlier. But what we didn't talk about was how our panel members who are still in the review process, actually how they feel about that. And I'm hoping that conversation does come up because I think it's important to hear from them. We have one out of about 20 scientists that felt that they needed to see the mine plan in order to really do that evaluation. So if that continues to come up as an issue, then I'm hoping that you all will ask them that question. So are there any other questions? Oh, the other thing that I said I would talk about is what we're thinking about doing for this final panel, where we're actually we want to look at the mine plan. So there's a couple of things that I think that the Keystone Center is thinking about here, and we know that the mine plan is a big question on people's minds, and that there's a lot of interest in actually seeing it. So our proposal to Pebble was to release the mine plan with enough lead time so that people really had a chance to evaluate it, and then for the Keystone Center to put together an independent science panel process to help evaluate the mine plan, and in addition to evaluating the mine plan, there's this interest in talking about what people have called the no mine condition, the no mine alternative, or the no mine option. So our final panel is a panel that we call evaluating choices, and it really it enables people to have this discussion about these two future scenarios. One future scenario is the region with a mine in place, and what that really means to people, and the other scenario is a future scenario with no mine in place, and what that means to people, and to have that discussion in the context of a science panel that will look at not only so the panel members in this case would be actually made up of a couple of different kinds of experts, but one of the kinds of experts would be scientists who evaluate mining impacts. So we're really talking about what are the risks, what are the potential mining impacts that people need to be aware of now that we know what the mine plan looks like. So we want to make sure we have people who study ecological risk assessment, people who study public health risk assessment, people who know the fishery, who know the economy, who know the social and cultural dimensions of the region. We also want people who know about mine planning and mine design and sustainable development around mining. So we want to bring back a couple of people from the very first panel. We want to bring back people who have been on our panels. And we want to bring in new people who have the kind of expertise that people really need to be able to evaluate a mine plan. And we probably want to do that over a two-day period. We want to do it in a location that's meaningful to people and where we can get good access and we can have a good conversation. I'm not sure where that is yet. It might be in the region. It might be someplace else. So that's generally our thinking. But what's constraining that right now is that there hasn't been a mine plan that's been released to the public, and I don't know any more than you do about whether it exists or not. When it's ready to be released, I think that's when we would start thinking about putting this panel together. We've already made contact with some panel members, so it's sort of very, very conceptual at this point. We were initially thinking about doing it in October, the end of October, but when we first started planning our panels, we waited till the baseline studies were released. We started scheduling the panels, and the idea was we wanted to create this sort of momentum. So we're doing baseline studies around geology, baseline studies around biology and socioeconomics, and then we review the mine plan. So the sequence hasn't worked because the sequence is now interrupted because there's no mine plan to review, and we have to wait for that to actually come out. So that's kind of where we are. That's the status of this right now. The other thing that Kirk alluded to earlier is that we have some baseline chapters of the baseline document that we don't have panel members to actually review, and those fall out around actually Lake Iliamna studies, which Dr. Schindler was going to review for us, around some of the not fish. We've got fish is well covered, around wetlands, around endangered species, around vegetation, and around traditional knowledge. So we have an expert who's going to help us evaluate subsistence conditions that Pebble has described, but the traditional knowledge is lacking, and we've talked to some great people who really want to help us, but haven't met that scheduling. So what we're thinking about is putting all of those together and having a final panel that focuses on kind of the interrelationship of wildlife, of vegetation, of endangered species, of wetlands, of traditional knowledge, and Lake Iliamna, and anything else that we feel that we discover there may be a gap here as we go through this. So we actually won't do it if you all haven't gotten enough out of this to feel that it's been worthwhile. But if you have gotten enough out of this, and we're still only in the first half a day, so we've really got 6 days to go through this. But if this is a valuable exercise for you all, and the science panel members are helpful in evaluating the baseline studies, then we would definitely want to do it. So this is sort of an experiment to see if this is a useful exercise. Any other questions for me before?
Shore and Brown with Trout Unlimited, I just wanted to, and this is not directed at any of the scientists in the room by any stretch, but I wanted to just pose a question. I mean, my takeaway from this morning is that the Keystone Center has a pretty considerable credibility gap to close at this point with the local communities, many of which you've supported the EPA watershed assessment, many of whom invited the EPA into their communities to investigate whether the Pebble mine is the right mine to go into Bristol Bay. And so you've got the Bristol Bay Native Corporation, tribes, many hunting and fishing groups, a coalition of faith-based organizations, Tiffany's, and 32 other jewelers. I could go on for 15 minutes. On one side, supporting what has been up to this point, and we heard that from local people this morning, perceived to be a very open dialogue and process run by an American agency that's accountable to American laws. And what I heard this morning anyway is that local people are very concerned about the fact that the same corporation that's spending millions of dollars to discredit the work that EPA has done up to this point. I was in Washington, D.C. last week and saw full-page ads in the Washington Post attacking the EPA, which is the same process that local people support. The same company paying for those ads is paying for this process. So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts about how the Keystone Center plans to try and plug that credibility gap, because at the end of the day, all the people that have concerns are the people that this company, in my mind, would be worrying the most about engaging in a meaningful process.
Okay, thanks. I think that's a good question. The short answer is that the panels will speak for themselves, as people have said, that they're reviewing the baseline studies as they would review any sort of peer review process. That's what we created. That's what we tried to create here. And so to the extent that the panel members are able to do that and do it in a credible way, is entirely different, entirely independent of whether the Keystone Center is being funded to do this. And I recognize that there's a credibility gap. We had a credibility gap going into the first panel, and at the end of that panel, opposition people were thanking me for the gift that we gave them. And I'm hoping that, we obviously want a balanced review of this document. And so the Keystone Center's entire focus is on making sure that this particular process and that these scientists are able to adequately review the baseline document, given that it's a 27,000-page document and there are limitations with doing that. That's very obvious to people, and if it's not obvious, it should be obvious that this is quite a monumental task for people to do while they're volunteering their time. So one answer is the panel should stand for themselves, and hopefully people will watch it and listen to what they say, because I don't think it will be a cakewalk for Pebble. I don't think it will. I think the idea here is let's have an independent scientific review and let's let the chips fall. That's the idea. So and criticisms of the EPA process, certainly the Keystone Center doesn't think that that's a good idea. We think that what EPA is evaluating is very different than what we're evaluating. That their science panel process and the way that they set up their science panels is very similar, if not identical, to the way we set up our science panel processes. So regardless of the science that went into creating the document, whether it's EPA document or the Pebble document, regardless of whether that was done well or not done well, the panels are really there. The science panels are really there to evaluate that, and that is really the test, and that's the only test as far as we're concerned. Obviously, there's a perception. So. I think for the Keystone Center, this is a big experiment to see if something like this could work. And as I read in my initial statement, highly polarized and politicized science is not in the best interest of science. That's not the way science really performs, because it's guarded. And you see all of those things in this process. Clearly, you see very, very guarded science. You see people touting science to support values. So what we don't know is the science credible, or is it or because it supports the value that you believe in, does that make it credible? We're trying to get the experiment is to see if we can get beyond that and have a dialogue among scientists in a way that is constructive. And that's entirely the Keystone Center's goal. And we were given an opportunity to do this by a large mining company that agreed to operate on our terms. So there's a lot of discussion about who should pay for it. Should EPA pay for it? Should the Nature Conservancy pay for it? I have a feeling the Nature Conservancy could actually pay for it, but and maybe the Nature Conservancy should be the organization that pays for it because of the reputation that the Nature Conservancy has around this whole idea of science. The whole idea of how do you do science in a credible way is really where we are, and we're aligned with organizations that believe in that value. So I want to honor the Nature Conservancy one more time by mentioning one of the things that one of their former presidents said that I loved about where the money comes from. He said, "It may be tainted, but it tain't enough." And I think that if we can be credible, if we can operate in a very, very credible way, the question really is, so the experiment that, and I'm maybe going on a little bit too long to answer this question, but it's a really important question, so I'm glad you raised it. The experiment that we're really conducting are two things. One is, can a large mining company like this enable an organization like the Keystone Center to put on a credible, objective process and not try to influence it? Can they pay for it, not influence it, and take people's advice? That's the question that's on the table. The other question that's on the table is anybody going to believe it? That's a very different question, and we may get to the end of this and say it's possible for a large resource development company to do this, but even if we do it in a very credible way, in a very objective way, there will still be doubts about it. So that, in some ways, is a bigger question. But because we're a mission-driven organization that's driven by bringing objective science into discussions, into forums, into dialogues and discussions. This is we think is where that discussion needs to take place in this particular situation, and that's why we're trying this experiment. So I don't know if that answers your question any better than you asked me out in the hallway. Hopefully you gave me a little time to think about it, so thank you. Other questions? I do think we want to get back to the panels. But yes, Phil.
Is there going to be a report at the end of this, or what's the final product going to look like? The
final product is a report that will be produced by the Keystone Center that will summarize all of these meetings and that will contain recommendations. And the recommendations for the science panel members are really around, since we're looking at the credibility and the sufficiency of baseline studies, if in areas where there may be gaps in information, in areas where there may be discrepancies in information, in areas where there needs to be more information or more studies of a particular area, more samples, the panel members will make those recommendations, and we'll capture those in a report, and then we'll make that report available to the public. Well, it's going to vary for each of the panels, but it will take so what we want to do is to get the report together, have it reviewed by the panel members, make sure they're comfortable with the recommendations, and then we'll release it. Will it be by the end of the year? It's really hard to say, but we're really dedicated and devoted to getting that finished. The other product of this is the discussion, having the discussion, and creating this. What we're trying to create is this dialogue and discussion. We're not trying to put anybody on the spot. We hope that you guys don't feel like you were facing a firing squad, because if you do, then this isn't working. But you handled it well. You're sitting up there with some pretty high-level people, and they're asking you tough questions, and then you have we're all kind of on the spot here. So so the product, that's another product that we really want to get out of here, is the discussion. Do people feel better informed? We're not trying to change anybody's minds about anything. I don't think we could do that if we tried, and we're certainly not trying. But are we being helpful in bringing science into a discussion in a meaningful way? If we can do that, then I think we've accomplished something. Okay. Well, thank you, and I'd be happy to take more questions and do this again if there are other questions. But let me go ahead and turn this back over to Kirk and Philip to sort of set up our next panel.